Well, grand rising to all of you, my family and friends, and of course, welcome to Ilonda Monet's Motivational Moment. Before I start, I have to do my salutations. Abaragani, Assalamu alaikum, Ikadro. Now that I've done my salutations, let's get into the meat of the message for today. Today we're going to talk about African American history before 1865. And we're going to talk about how slavery arises in the colonial America. Slavery's rise in colonial America was a complex process driven by economics, political, and social factors. European colonizers and the demand for labor in cash crop plantations led to the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, transforming the dynamics and the culture landscape of the Americas. The institution of slavery had profound and lasting impact on American society. It created a rigid racial hierarchy, shaped legal and economic systems, and influenced cultural development. Despite harsh conditions, enslaved Africans resist oppression and maintain their cultural heritage by leaving an enduring legacy. Now let's go to the historical content. European colonizers of the Americas began in the late 15th century, driven by economic, political, and religious motives. Early colonial economies relied on Native American labor and industrial servants from Europe. The transatlantic slave emerged as a solution to the labor shortages in the colonies, particularly in the Caribbean and South America. Slavery existed in Africa prior to European involvement, but the scale and nature of the transatlantic slave trade was unpredictable. European powers such as Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands competed for dominance in the slave trade and colonizing expansion. The slave trade and plantation agriculture became intrigued and integrated into the economic development of the European colonies in the Americas. Slavery in the British North American colonies evolved gradually, with regional differences in the Low Country and the North colonies. Now, the origin and expansion. Portuguese began trading enslaved Africans in the mid-1500s, initially to work on the sugar plantations in Malaria or Sotum. Spanish colonizers of the Caribbean and South America created demand for labor met by importing of the African or enslaved Africans. The first enslaved Africans arrived in the British North American colonies in 1619, Jamestown, Virginia. Slave trade expanded rapidly in the 17th and 18th centuries, driven by the growth of plantation agriculture. British colonies in the Caribbean, like the Bahamas and Jamaica, and Chesapeake Bay, like in Virginia and Maryland, became major destinations for enslaved Africans. Slave trade involved complex networks of African merchants, European traders, and American buyers. An estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade between the years of 1526 and 1866. Approximately 388,000 enslaved Africans were brought from the British North American colonies. Now, how did this affect us economically? Europeans' demand for cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton fueled the expansion of the plantation agriculture in the Americas. Plantation systems required a large, cheap, and controllable labor force, which enslaved Africans provided. Slave trade generated immense profits of European merchants, investors, and colony planters. Slavery became the foundation of the colonial economy of the Caribbean and the America South. By 1750, enslaved Africans constituted the majority of the population in many of the British Columbia colonies. Slave labor was used in various industries, including agriculture, mining, construction, domestic service. Slave trade stimulated the development of shipbuilding, banking, the insurance industry in Europe and in the colonies. Economic benefits of slavery extended beyond the colonies, contributing to the growth in cities and industries in Europe. Now let's talk about the framework. Slavery in the British colonies were initially governed by customs and common law, with uniform legal laws or legal codes. Slave codes emerged in the 17th century and the 18th century to regulate slavery and the statutes of enslaved Africans. In Virginia, 1705, slave code serves as a model for other colonies. Slave codes denied enslaved Africans basic rights and protections, treated them as property rather than persons. Slave codes denied African Americans of just regular human rights. Enslaved Africans could not own property. We could not testify in the courts against whites, and we could not legally marry. Slave codes established harsh punishments for people who tried to escape, including whippings, brandings, and even executions. Legal status of slavery were inherited through the mother, ensured and perpetrated to slaved status across generations. British courts and litigation constantly upheld the legality of slavery and the proper rights of the slave holders. Now let's talk about the impact. Slavery created a rigid racial hierarchy in the colonies, which enslaved Africans and were enslaved Africans as the bottom and the white colonists as the top. Enslaved Africans faced brutal living and working conditions, including inadequate housing and medical care. Enslaved individuals were subject to physical and sexual violence, family separation, and psychological trauma. Slaves worked long hours under harsh conditions with the constant threat of physical punishment. Skilled laborers worked as blacksmiths or coopers, but most were agriculture laborers. Slave owners extracted as much labor as possible to max profits. Domestic slave trade expanded as a demand for labor growth, particularly after the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, in which a black man invented. Some slaves were hired out by their owners, with the wages going strictly to the owner. Slave breeding became common to replenish the labor force as the intentional slave trade had ended. In 1860, nearly 4 million African Americans were enslaved, representing a huge economic investment for Southern slave owners. Now, how did these racial practices and traditions affect those involved? Despite the hardships of slavery, African Americans developed a distinct cultural blending of African and European elements. Music was an important part of the slavery culture, with spiritual expressions both sorrow and hope. Call and response styles of rhythm complex reflected African Americans' music traditions. Oral traditions including storytelling, folk tales, and proverbs that taught lessons and preserved history. Religion played a central role in the slave community, with a blend of Christian and African spiritual practices. Slaves often held secret religious meanings away from their white control. Families was important to slaves. Throughout, families were often separated or sold. Extend kin networks and fictional of kin help provide support. You know that cousin that ain't really your cousin, but that's your cousin? Yeah. Naming practices reflect African history and family connections. Using African name, they name their children after their family members. Festivals and holidays such as Christmas and Juneteenth, well, that became later, it was called Junko, provided a break from the labor and a chance to celebrate communities. Now, how did this go into the rebellion? Slaves resisted their oppressors in many ways. Some small, everyday acts to open the rebellion, like by 1570, enslaved Africans constituted the majority of the population in the British South. Okay, now let's see. Enslaved were subject to physical and mental violence, and their families were separated by social trauma. Now, the cultural influences include enslaved brought diverse cultural traditions to West and Central Africa to the colonies, including music, dance, storytelling, and religious practice. African culture influence shaped the development of the distinct African American culture in the colonies, particularly in the Low Country and in the Caribbean. The Gullah culture in the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia preserved strong with African culture elements. Enslaved Africans adopted Christianity to their own spiritual needs, creating symbolic religious practice that blend African and Christian cultures. Ring a Shout, a religious ritual involving singing, dancing, percussions, and originated among slave Africans in the colony. African music, traditions such as call and response, singing, and complex hymns influenced the development of African American genres such as spirituals, blues, and jazz. African agriculture acknowledged the techniques including rice cultivating and animal husbandry combined and contribute to the successful of the colony plantations. African culinary traditions such as okra, black-eyed peas, yams shaped the development of Southern cuisine. African influence on language, such as words and grammar structures, can be found in the African American vernacular English. Now, the legacy and long-term effects. Slavery and the transatlantic slave trade had profound and long-lasting impacts on African American history, American society, and global economic and political systems. Economic legacy of slavery included the concentration of wealth and power among white elites, the underdevelopment of African South of the American South, and global dominance of the European colony powers. Racial inequities and discrimination rooted in slavery persisted long after the institution of abolition shaped African American experiences and opportunities. Jim Crow laws, segregation, racial violence, and the post-Civil War era were directly legacies of slavery. Slavery, psychological and cultural impact on African American communities can be seen in the ongoing struggle of identity, equality, and social justice. African Americans in intellectual and cultural traditions forged in the circumference of slavery had made significant contributions to American culture and global scholarship. Complementary debates over reparations, affirmative action, and the memorialization of slavery reflection on ongoing legacy of this historical injustice. Slavery roles in the economic and political governments and developments of the United States remain in constant and often unknown aspects of American history. Global legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, including the persistent economical and social disparities between Africa, Europe, and the Americas, as well as the cultural and dynamic transformations of the African diaspora. So with that being said, we have brought a lot to America. Even though we were physically and forcibly removed from our homeland, we brought certain things over from Africa so that we can have a little bit of our history. And as years pass and as things have gone on, we have lost a lot of our culture. We have lost a lot of our rituals. Before we came over here, we had a vast number of a lot of things. I mean, we were great in math, astrology, all those kinds of things. And when we came over here, we were considered dumb, ignorant. But we are the ones that taught them how to make their particular colony expand and or become products or become a greater asset to the actual colony. So with that being said, guys, don't ever forget who you are. Don't ever forget that you do have a place in this world and that your gifts are needed, wanted, and required in a time such as this. Right now, it looks like, and I'm just speaking from my own eyes, that time is changing and going backwards instead of us moving forward. So let's push forward everything that we need to do in order to make sure that we are here and that we're not going anywhere. So with that being said, guys, I gotta go. I love you, but God loves you more. And remember, I'll see you at the top because what? The bottom is way too crowded. Peace.